For centuries, history books dismissed them as bedtime stories. We were told that monsters, apocalyptic floods, and cursed cities were nothing more than myths, invented by our ancestors to explain away the dark, terrifying forces of an untamed world. But we were wrong. Recently, modern archaeology has quietly begun uncovering things that shouldn't exist. And as the dirt is brushed away, a chilling reality is setting in. The ancient legends weren't exaggerations. In fact, the physical truth left behind in the soil is far more violent and far more terrifying than the stories we've been told. Today, we look at 7 ancient legends that science just proved true and the dark reality they left behind. For nearly 3,000 years, Homer's Iliad was treated by mainstream historians as a beautiful work of fiction. The epic tale of a decade-long war, bloodthirsty heroes like Achilles and Hector, a legendary wooden horse, and the impregnable towering walls of Troy was considered a romantic masterpiece, but historically impossible. For centuries, academics openly laughed at anyone foolish enough to go looking for it. They insisted that Troy was nothing more than a myth, born out of the overactive imagination of an ancient Greek poet. That was until the late 19th century, when an eccentric, obsessive German explorer named Heinrich Schliemann decided to prove the world wrong. Armed with nothing but a copy of the Iliad, which he used as a literal treasure map, Schliemann began digging into a massive artificial mound in Hisarlik, Turkey, and to the absolute shock of the scientific community, he found it. He didn't just find one city. He found a staggering stack of 9 different civilizations built right on top of each other over thousands of years. Layer number 7 matched the exact geographical layout, the massive stone walls, and the precise timeline described by Homer. Against all odds, the legendary city of Troy was real. But as modern archaeologists took over the site and began brushing away the centuries of dirt, the romantic veil of Homer's poetry completely shattered. What they uncovered wasn't a place of honorable heroes and poetic tragedies. Schliemann had dug up a brutal, claustrophobic slaughterhouse. When experts carefully excavated the streets of Troy 7, they stumbled upon a cinematic nightmare frozen in time. They found human skeletons scattered carelessly across the stone pathways, their bones completely shattered by heavy, blunt force weaponry. These weren't soldiers buried with honor. These were people left to rot where they fell. Forensic scientists, looking through microscopes, found craniums that had been violently split open by battle axes. But the most heartbreaking discoveries were found hidden deep within the dark, cramped crawl spaces beneath the houses. There, archaeologists unearthed the skeletal remains of young children and infants. They had crawled into the dark to hide from the invading army, only to choke to death on toxic smoke or be baked alive as the buildings above them collapsed in flames. The physical evidence proved that the fall of Troy was an apocalyptic catastrophe. Archaeologists uncovered a massive, dense layer of charred black ash and melted debris covering the entire city. This showed that Troy didn't just lose a war, it was systematically, violently burned to the ground while its population was trapped inside the walls. The Troy of reality was a place of pure horror. There were no honorable duels between champions under the sun. Instead, it was a desperate fortress where thousands of innocent civilians were starved out, terrorized, and eventually butchered in the dark by a merciless occupying army that left no survivors. The legend was real, but the truth was a bloodbath. Around 360 BC, the Greek philosopher Plato introduced the world to an unforgettable nightmare. He wrote about Atlantis, a utopian island empire so advanced, so wealthy, and so powerful that it conquered most of Western Europe and Africa. According to Plato, this super-civilization featured massive concentric rings of land and water, grand palaces, and an unbeatable navy. But over time, the Atlanteans grew arrogant, greedy, and corrupt. In response, the gods unleashed their fury. In a single day and night of catastrophic earthquakes and floods, the entire island of Atlantis slid into the sea, vanished beneath the waves, and was erased from human history forever. For over 2,000 years, mainstream science treated this story as a complete fairy tale. Academics insisted that Plato invented Atlantis as a fictional metaphor, a bedtime story about the dangers of political pride. But then, underwater archaeologists and geologists began investigating the Aegean Sea, specifically the volcanic island of Santorini. And what they uncovered proved that Plato wasn't writing a work of fiction. He was recording the terrifying historical memory of a real-world apocalypse. Around 1600 BC, Santorini was home to the Minoans, an incredibly advanced, wealthy seafaring civilization. Their architecture featured multi-story buildings, indoor plumbing, and breathtaking artwork. But Santorini was also a ticking time bomb. The entire island was built around a colossal volcano. And in that fateful year, the volcano suffered one of the most violent cataclysms in the history of the Earth. The eruption exploded with the power of several hundred atomic bombs. The blast was so violently destructive that the entire center of the island collapsed directly into the ocean, creating a massive, flooded crater that perfectly mirrors Plato's description of concentric rings of land sliding into the sea. But the true horror of what happened to the people of this real-life Atlantis is what science uncovered next. The collapse of the volcano triggered a mega tsunami over 200 feet high. This wall of water raced across the Mediterranean Sea at the speed of a jet airliner, slamming into the nearby island of Crete and completely pulverizing every coastal city of the Minoan Empire in a matter of minutes. When modern archaeologists excavated Akrotiri, a Minoan city on Santorini buried under thick layers of volcanic ash, they expected to find thousands of skeletons. Instead, they found almost none. At first, this sounds like good news, but the geological reality is far more terrifying. It means the citizens felt the warning earthquakes, panicked, and fled to the beaches to escape on their advanced fleet of ships. They thought the open ocean would save them. Instead, they sailed straight into a trap. The mega tsunami caught the entire Minoan civilization in the open water, instantly smashing their ships into kindling and dragging tens of thousands of people down to the pitch-black bottom of the sea. Plato wasn't writing a clever philosophical metaphor. He was recording a terrifying warning about how easily the Earth can swallow an advanced superpower whole, leaving nothing behind but a silent, watery grave. In November 1922, a British archaeologist named Howard Carter made a discovery that would change history forever. Deep inside the Valley of the Kings in Egypt, he breached a sealed doorway and stepped into the tomb of King Tutankhamun. The world went wild. It was a treasure trove of gold, jewels, and ancient artifacts untouched for over 3,000 years. But alongside the glitz and glamour, a terrifying legend was born. According to newspapers at the time, an ancient tablet inside the tomb carried a chilling inscription. It warned that death will fly on swift wings to anyone who disturbs the peace of the pharaoh. At first, the public dismissed it as superstition. But then, the bodies started piling up. Just a few months after entering the tomb, Lord Carnarvon, the wealthy financier who funded the entire excavation, suffered a sudden, severe fever and died under mysterious circumstances in a Cairo hospital. At the exact moment he passed away, the lights across the entire city of Cairo mysteriously went out. Within a few years, more than a dozen people associated with the opening of the tomb died strange, sudden deaths, from aggressive pneumonia and organ failure to sudden strokes. The curse of the pharaohs became a global sensation, mocked by modern scientists as pure coincidence. But recently, epidemiologists, biologists, and medical researchers decided to investigate the actual air trapped inside sealed Egyptian tombs. What they discovered wasn't magic or supernatural witchcraft, but it was a terrifyingly deliberate form of biological warfare. When a pharaoh was buried, the ancient priests packed the tombs with massive amounts of organic materials. We are talking about baskets of fruits, raw meats, embalming fluids, and vegetables designed to feed the king in the afterlife. The heavy stone tombs were then sealed completely airtight for thousands of years. Think about that environment. You have an airtight, pitch-black room with zero ventilation, extreme desert heat, and rotting organic materials. Over 3 millennia, these substances mutated and decayed, turning the sealed chamber into a highly concentrated biological weapon. Scientists isolated a deadly, aggressive fungus called Aspergillus flavus inside these ancient tombs. This specific mold is incredibly resilient and can survive in a dormant state for thousands of years in dry, dark places. The moment Howard Carter and his team breached that stone door, they didn't just let in fresh air, they unleashed millions of microscopic, highly toxic fungal spores that had been concentrated for 3 millenniums. When an unsuspecting explorer breathes in this ancient air, these spores enter the lungs. For anyone with a slightly weakened immune system, the fungus triggers a massive, explosive allergic reaction known as aspergillosis. It causes severe respiratory distress, internal bleeding in the lungs, and rapid, agonizing organ failure. The ancient Egyptians might not have known the modern terminology of microbiology, but they understood a basic rule of nature. If you seal organic decay inside a hot, airtight room for centuries, you create a toxic gas chamber. The curse was real. It wasn't written in magic ink, but engineered by ancient priests to ensure that the very first breath an intruder took inside the pharaoh's sacred home would be their absolute last. High in the Peruvian Andes, precariously balanced on razor-sharp ridges and perpetually wrapped in thick, ghostly mist, lie the world's most mesmerizing ruins, the cities in the clouds. The most famous of them all, of course, is Machu Picchu. For more than a century, mainstream history books and tourism brochures have painted a beautiful, romantic picture of this place. We were told it was a peaceful spiritual sanctuary, a majestic royal retreat where Incan emperors and sun priests went to meditate, study the stars, and commune with the gods, far away from the chaotic, violent conflicts of the lower valleys. It is a beautiful story, but when modern forensic anthropologists and bioarchaeologists began digging into the dark, damp burial caves surrounding these mountaintop structures, that romantic myth completely shattered. The truth of why these cities were built in such extreme, terrifyingly inaccessible heights is not a story of spiritual enlightenment. It is a story of absolute desperation and survival. You see, Machu Picchu and the other cloud cities weren't luxury resorts. They were heavily fortified, panicked bastions of a dying empire. When forensic scientists analyzed the skeletons found at the site under microscopes, they discovered a horrifying pattern of severe, violent trauma. A massive percentage of the bones belonged to individuals who had suffered brutal, agonizing deaths. Archaeologists identified shattered jawbones, fractured skulls crushed by heavy stone maces, and deep, violent cuts left by sharp copper battle axes. These people weren't peaceful monks. They were battle-hardened soldiers and traumatized civilians who had experienced brutal warfare. But the enemy they were running away from wasn't just human. Anthropologists discovered a dark secret written inside the DNA of the bone marrow. The population hiding in these cloud cities was fleeing from a silent, invisible killer that was systematically liquidating their civilization. Smallpox and European diseases. These biological plagues had mutated and traveled through South America faster than the Spanish conquistadors themselves, wiping out entire villages before a single white man ever set foot there. When you look closely at the architecture of these cloud cities through the lens of military paranoia, everything changes. The steep, vertical cliffs weren't chosen for the beautiful view. They were chosen because they were a natural fortress. The narrow, dizzying stone staircases leading up to the city were intentionally booby-trapped. They were designed with hidden gaps and structural weak points so that if an enemy army tried to climb up, the defenders could instantly collapse the stairs, sending the intruders plummeting thousands of feet to their deaths into the rocky abyss below. The people living in the clouds weren't meditating. They were terrified refugees, starving on freezing mountain peaks, surrounded by disease, and watching the smoke of their burning empire rise from the valleys far below. They built their homes in the sky because the earth below had turned into a living hell, waiting for a brutal enemy that they knew would eventually find them. Every major ancient culture on our planet, from the Hebrews in the Holy Bible to the ancient Babylonians in the Epic of Gilgamesh, all the way to Mesoamerican tribes half a world away, tells the exact same terrifying story. They speak of a great flood, an apocalyptic deluge sent by the gods that drowned the known world, wiped humanity off the face of the earth, and forced a chosen few to escape on a massive custom-built ark. For generations, modern science and secular historians completely dismissed this global flood as an impossible campfire myth. After all, geologists calculated that there simply isn't enough water on Earth to cover the peak of Mount Everest. But recently, oceanographers and marine geologists turned their high-tech sonar equipment toward the Black Sea and the Persian Gulf. And what they discovered beneath the waves proved that an apocalyptic, world-ending flood did happen. But the reality wasn't 40 days of gentle, steady rain. The real event was a violent, crushing nightmare of physics. Around 7,500 years ago, the Earth was transitioning out of the last major ice age. Massive continental glaciers began to melt, causing global ocean levels to skyrocket at an alarming rate. The Mediterranean Sea rose so high and with so much pressure that it eventually breached the natural dirt dam that separated it from what is now the Black Sea Basin. At the time, that basin was a massive, low-lying, incredibly fertile freshwater valley, home to hundreds of advanced agricultural villages. It was the cradle of human civilization at the time. When that natural land barrier finally failed and cracked open, the entire weight of the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea slammed into the valley. This wasn't a slow rise of water where you could pack your bags and walk away. This was a colossal, roaring waterfall with the force of more than 200 times the volume of Niagara Falls. A monstrous wall of pressurized salt water, hundreds of feet high, tore through the landscape at highway speeds. It didn't just flood the villages, it vaporized them. It shattered forests, pulverized stone structures, and dissolved mud brick towns in a matter of seconds. The terrifying, low-frequency roar of the approaching water could be heard for hundreds of miles before the actual wave arrived, giving the inhabitants a few hours of pure, paralyzing panic. For the people trapped in that basin, their entire known universe, every city they had ever built, every mountain they had ever climbed, and every person they had ever loved, was permanently submerged under hundreds of feet of black ocean water in less than a few weeks. If you were standing on the edge of that basin, the horizon was nothing but an endless, violent sea of death. Our ancestors didn't just experience a bad storm, they witnessed the literal, violent fracturing of the planet's geography. It was a trauma so deep, so absolute, that it burned itself permanently into the collective DNA of human memory, transforming a real-world geological apocalypse into the enduring legend of Noah's Ark. The Greek legend of the Minotaur is one of humanity's oldest and most enduring nightmares. According to myth, King Minos of Crete built a massive, inescapable underground labyrinth to hide a horrifying monster, a creature half man and half bull that hungered for human flesh. Every year, the defeated city of Athens was forced to pay a brutal tribute. They had to send 7 innocent young men and 7 young women into the pitch-black maze, where they would be hunted down and eaten alive by the beast. For millennia, historians treated this as pure fantasy. But in the early 1900s, a British archaeologist named Sir Arthur Evans excavated the ancient city of Knossos on the island of Crete. And what he found stunned the world. He unearthed a colossal, sprawling Bronze Age palace covering several acres. It featured over 1,000 interconnected windowless rooms, twisting corridors, and confusing dead ends. It looked exactly like a labyrinth. The physical setting of the myth was real. But what about the monster? What about the children who were supposedly eaten alive? For decades, scholars argued that the devouring of children was just a poetic metaphor for political oppression. But in recent years, teams of forensic archaeologists digging deep into the sealed, subterranean storage chambers beneath the palace made a discovery that sent a shiver down the spine of the scientific community. They unearthed the skeletal remains of young children. When experts placed these bones under advanced electron microscopes, they didn't find the random bite marks of an animal. Instead, they found something far more calculated and far more chilling. The bones bore unmistakable, systematic cut marks left by razor-sharp ancient butcher knives. The evidence proved that the flesh had been intentionally, professionally stripped from the bones of these children. Even worse, these human remains were found discarded in the dark, mixed directly with the bones of slaughtered sheep and cattle. The Minotaur wasn't a biological monster with horns. The Minotaur was the code name for a brutal, elite religious cult of the Minoan civilization. The beast was actually a fanatical order of high priests who wore heavy, terrifying bull masks during secret rituals. The labyrinth wasn't a prison for a monster, it was a state-sponsored slaughterhouse. Athens really was forced to send their youth across the sea as a tribute. But these teenagers weren't hunted in a maze by a mythical animal. The truth is infinitely worse. They were led into the dark, subterranean depths of the palace, bound to stone altars, and systematically butchered by civilized humans in masks as part of a horrific ritual of human sacrifice and cannibalism. Our ancestors didn't invent a monster to scare children. They invented a monster because the reality of what human beings were doing to each other in the dark was simply too terrifying to write down in plain words. The myth was a cover story for a house of horrors. For generations, explorers emerging from the dense, suffocating jungles of Central America returned with tales of a ghost world. They described massive, beautiful stone pyramids, grand plazas, and towering palaces, completely wrapped in thick vines and buried under layers of ancient moss. As historians tried to explain these ruins, a romantic legend was born. We were told that the ancient Maya were a deeply peaceful, enlightened civilization of astronomers, mathematicians, and philosophers. The story went that when their calendar cycle ended, or when the environment shifted, they simply packed up their things, abandoned their cities in harmony, and walked away into the sunset, allowing the jungle to peacefully swallow their empire whole. It is a beautiful, comforting fairy tale. But in recent years, science deployed LiDAR, a revolutionary laser scanning technology that shoots billions of laser beams from airplanes straight through the thick jungle canopy to map the ground below. And what LiDAR revealed completely shattered the myth of the peaceful Maya. Underneath the green canopy of the Guatemalan and Mexican jungles, archaeologists discovered a highly militarized, terrifying landscape of global proportions. LiDAR uncovered over 60,000 previously unknown structures. But these weren't peaceful farms or stargazing towers. They were massive, continuous highway networks of heavy military fortifications. Scientists spotted defensive stone walls stretching for miles, hidden mountain fortresses, and heavily guarded checkpoints. The physical archaeology now proves a horrifying truth. The collapse of the Maya civilization wasn't a peaceful migration. It was a prolonged, apocalyptic, continental civil war driven by catastrophic climate change, extreme drought, and mass starvation. As the rains stopped and the crops failed, these ancient superpowers didn't cooperate. They turned on each other with unimaginable, desperate ferocity. When archaeologists dug down into the dirt of cities like Aguateca and Kola, they found the undeniable evidence of a sudden, brutal bloodbath. They uncovered mass graves inside grand plazas where entire royal families and elite classes had been systematically executed and thrown into ditches. At the site of Aguateca, the excavations revealed a cinematic nightmare. The entire population had fled or been slaughtered in such a chaotic hurry that they left their most valuable jade tools, unfinished meals, and sacred pottery scattered all over the palace floors. Right before the city's massive defensive walls were violently breached and the structures were burned to the ground. The jungle didn't swallow these cities because the people left in peace. The jungle swallowed them because the population was completely decimated, starved out, and annihilated in a brutal war for survival where no one won. The massive stone pyramids we see today are not monuments to a spiritual utopia. They are colossal, silent tombstones for millions of people who tore each other apart in the dark. The legend claimed they vanished into thin air, but the truth is buried in a mass grave beneath the trees. In the end, these 7 legends teach us a powerful, humbling lesson. We like to look back at our ancestors with a sense of superiority, dismissing their warnings as primitive fairy tales. But archaeology is forcing us to face a much darker reality. They weren't lying to us, they were trying to warn us. When they spoke of global apocalypses, ancient curses, or monsters in the dark, They were recording the raw, unfiltered trauma of a fragile species trying to survive a violent planet. Human civilization is not permanent. Our grip on this earth is incredibly fragile. The ancient ruins sleeping beneath our oceans, under our modern streets, and inside our densest jungles are not just tourist attractions. They are mirrors, and they are actively warning us that the legends we think are safely locked away in our past have a terrifying habit of coming true all over again.